Anyway, to cut a long story short, I moved back in '95 because my husband got a job here. He's a scientist. And there wasn't much, happening. Shrishti had just started in '96. I started working here in '97. But I wanted to show some of the work I had done. And in a way it related to the house and to my grandmother, because one year when I was visiting, I got interested. I suppose, when you live away, you sort of reflect, you reflect back much more on who you are and the kind of, complex, history that, many of us, have, families that are not, that come from different places, have migrated to different parts of the world or within India. So I started investigating, the conversion of my mother's family to Christianity in the 19th century, and I found that as they were sort of coming into this new identity, and which was coinciding with many things such as also the invention of photography, modernity, the world wars were beginning, so there were many sort of historical events that were happening, and somehow you could extrapolate how a family gets kind of caught up in the web of historical sort of change, and I started sort of then, sort of breaking down these photographs and some of the sort of letters and documents that I was finding. And what came out of it was an exhibition which I first had in so there's just a page here. There are some images, I'll go to them. And it was called Looks the Other Way, because I sort of took a photograph where my grandmother is amidst this group of people, and there's a missionary, and this woman is looking away. And I named this series called, She Looks the Other Way. And so I took, I think, 4 photographs, and I kind of looked at different components of the picture, sort of extraneous detail that you would not consider the main core of the picture. And I created a whole installation based on that. So I describe it. It's comprised of photographs, sculptured objects, embossed surfaces and sound, playing upon our familiar relationship to photographic images. With a sense of the personal, I fragmented images of family conversion to Christianity in colonial India from found family photographs, retrieving details from colonial and missionary images, archival film footage, and placing them alongside details from family portraits. The show formed a kind of terrain of images. And as these sequences unfolded, the images fragment further and new relationships are implied in a refusal to control the narrative. And the images were punctuated with the presence of other objects. This was a photograph of my grandfather with my grandmother, so I sort of just sliced it across, just to show like what she was, what she was looking in terms of looking into, as she looked into the camera, looking into the future in terms of what her aspiration may have been, and what my grandfather, living in South India and in Bombay, dressed up in 3-piece suits, completely, out of character to the kind of weather, but what he was sort of imagining as coming into modern life. And then I took plastic dolls that I found in the marketplace and did plaster casts and multiplied them, so then there was a room that was covered with these dolls. And it came from this series, which was on the corner of the room, where you see my aunt clutching onto this porcelain, this, doll that would have traveled across the seas. So after that, I mean, then much later I did something on my grandfather, because there was this bunch of photographs where he goes to the World War I, Mesopotamia, as a kind of scribe. In those days, if you had learned how to use a typewriter, you were called a typewriter. And so again, the sort of jobs he got then were, I mean, connected to the way that he dressed, was, in the police, in the army, and then finally he is a journalist. So I am with all these different documents that kind of chronicle this sort of bureaucratic scaffold that people are being thrusted into with modern life, So I've done, I mean, there are a bunch of films that you could all watch. In around 2000, I sort of started looking for amateur film. I had got introduced to the idea before I left America that we were now at a point where a lot of our old media, was, going to face obliteration, like it was going to disappear, and there's been so much emphasis on sort of professional film, and there are archives that house these films, production houses, but even that is under threat actually, because it takes a lot to keep original film. But what happens in families as a whole generation passes, and how lifestyle changes. So from these old bungalows, now we all live in flats, right? And families, if you don't have someone interested in the media, they throw them out. They become like garbage that just gets thrown out. So across the world, there seem to be, like, for artists and filmmakers, like almost an urgency to preserve some of these memories. So when I moved back to Bangalore, it seemed, because it was still a sleepy place, and because it still had a generation of people who were now aging and about to sort of on their way out, it was the sunset of their lives, I started looking for amateur film in the cantonment, because the cantonment was populated by a range of different kinds of people, from Anglo-Indians to different people from across India, from Tamil Nadu, but they had been associated with the cantonment in one way or the other, with printing presses or publishing or the army base itself. So I discovered that a lot of them had hobbies, and they had cameras, and these cameras would be exchanged and would be, would become, something that people would borrow, they would sell. There was a whole economy around these cameras, and some film cameras, Super 8 film cameras too. And that was a format that had got kind of, it had died out because the films were not easy to process. But I was lucky that, when I started asking people in the neighborhood, one person sort of, even though a lot of professionals said you will never find any, because, India's too poor a country for people to have, a hobby as film, within the home. But actually, even if it was for a short duration, and you may find that among your grandparents as well, that even if it was for a short duration, it was it was like a toy, you know, I know, a hobby that people adopted for a while, especially when your children are young and you're, you know, going on picnics and you're traveling and all that. So anyway, so I started, and I was just, it was fortuitous that I found a collection from 1938, which was, you know, really in the middle of the war. The war was starting, he was making films up to 42, but using the environs of Cooktown, of Bangalore, and by default you see what the city looked like then, you know. So I made my first film called Straight 8.
I was born in 1910. I think it was 1932. I was working in Madras. I got married in Madras. And my parents were not too well. We shifted from Madras to Bangalore. And to get Bangalore, it was a coveted station. Everybody wanted to get in here, you see, because at that time, Bangalore was pensioners' paradise, and not only that, it was a paradise for everybody. The climate was wonderful, the people were friendly, there was no crowding, there was no traffic like this has never been seen before.
And then subsequently found some other collections and made about 5 or 6 films. Yashas has done the sound for some of them. I did have an exhibition called Film Tales in 2010, and I showed the film, Straight 8 there, and had sort of some other sound pieces. There was a phone called, and the piece was called Calling the Nation. I had recorded in the old days when you made an STD call. I don't know if any of you remember that, but when you called a different state or a different town, you got a recording, especially if it was a wrong number. So you got a recording in that language, and depending on where you were calling, like if it was UP and Lucknow, there was always some music, very nice, you know, sort of sitar or something, some classical music. And you could actually, I mean, not every place, sometimes you get an engaged sound, but there were different kinds of voices across. If you call Assam, you got a recording in English, Hindi, and maybe Assamese. You got, you know, so there was this incredible diversity that you could access through just. So and we had phone directories in those days. So I would just go through the phone directories and call all these STD, you know, codes and see where I could get a recording and try to record it very crudely. Unfortunately, I think I've lost this piece, but I want to recreate it. So there was that. It was called Calling the Nation.
Sorry, how did you go about recording those sounds?
The sound. I had one of those little dictaphones with those tiny tapes, you know. I mean, there was no sort of Sennheiser or no expensive equipment or there was no computer to sort of connect the actual phone to whatever. I just what I would do is I would get up, but of course I live, you know, next to this railway line that had about 168 trains go past. So I would get up at about 4:30, hoping that, you know, it would be quieter than later because the main road, there's the railway line. But then, of course, you know, the early morning trains from Tamil Nadu would come at about 4:30 or 5. So I couldn't prevent the sounds of the train. So the recording has them, but then it sort of added another layer to it. Like it was another sort of, you know, kind of symbol of something, because it was almost like we were traversing or traveling different places as we were discovering these, you know, this wrong number, like it was like a dead end. And yet there was this, you know, the sound of the train. So I actually ended up using the train sound a lot. Like it starts with the train and ends with the train. I don't think I have that sound piece here. Yeah, this was like a shadow, which the light kind of tripped and projected a shadow of this luggage rack. Yeah, so some things were just like one-liners, and then there was this film. And then, in fact, I don't know if some of you saw my recent exhibition. You may have seen the film on the Kolar goldfields, the KGF. So I had actually started that. It was called Subterranea. I did this exhibition in something called Samoha. I don't know if Yashas remembers it. Suresh Kumar had, one of our artists had taken on, he tried to do an experiment where artists contribute to a fund, and he ran a gallery for a year, and in exchange for what one contributed, one was able to have a show. So there were like, that many artists, who contributed, they would have exhibitions, and in between, younger people and people who, couldn't otherwise show their work would be able to show their work. So I kind of did that piece for this, and I showed that in relation to the Kolar goldfields. For those of you, do you know where it is, the Kolar? So it's like the first gold mine. I mean, it's one of the earliest gold mines in the world, kind of almost as old as the gold mine in South Africa, though I think that came first, and then KGF, because again it relates to kind of industrialization and modernity, because the British then actually decide to colonize or to formally bring India under this, make it a part of the empire, because they see that there is this gold that can be extracted, and with machinery you can go deeper. So until then, the East India Company was just trading. They would, and it was like, because they then discovered that, okay, now with these machines that have been invented, that have gone into the mines in South Africa, that perhaps this would also be a wealth. So KGF becomes like a place where it's the first place to be electrified in India. It's the first railway line that's set from Kolar to Bangalore to bring the gold out that can be then shipped across. And it's the first place to have a kind of gated community, that becomes part of our public sector later, where, you have a golf course, you have tennis courts, you have, schools and hospitals all within a sort of gated. So I was simultaneously also, through Tom Dagger's films, Straight 8, one of his films has a dancer, half Burmese, half Rajput, and I project this film. It's 8mm. It was shot in like maybe 1941, on a terrace in Cantonment, much like the house I just showed you. And it was about, so I kind of juxtapose this Kolar journey with my discovery of this dancer, also born in 1912. He's half Burmese, half Rajput. He's living in the Cantonment. He's gay. He's learnt different traditional forms of dance, and yet he also does kind of like more work. He's choreographing for the new proscenium theatre.
A beautiful dancer, such a beautiful dancer, and so graceful, so graceful. I mean, he's like a female dancer, not a male dancer.
He was quite a charismatic character, being half Burmese and half Rajput.
He was always elegant, always with that turban.
We used to call him the Indian god.
The Westerners think he's an Indian Raja.
He was very fond of himself. He was a narcissist.
He was such a strong person inside, such such a strong. His arms were like water, when he used to do his dance of the setting sun, it's like water. But inside, that person was so strong. He could face anything.
People were fascinated by his movements and his looks and his expression and his talk. And he talked very beautifully.
Don't just dance as a god, be that god.
So a lot of these things we took. So what I would say is that in a way my work was kind of just looking at many little aspects, many aspects of our existence, our day-to-day life that we just sort of take for granted, right? So, when you look at a photograph, what are the hidden things that are being communicated in that, photograph? So, Ram Gopal kind of is born at that time where he starts choreographing for the theatre. So that also becomes like it's like a constellation of different things, There's the gold, there's the machinery, there's the camera, there's the photograph, there's the proscenium, there's identity being shaped in relation to all of this, You're sort of, as humans, responding, you're not impervious to this. So a lot of my work, my early work kind of was fascinated by this. But it was also the time when, we were influenced by Foucault's order of things. I don't know if some of you know Michel Foucault, but who also deconstructed how our cities were built to prevent protest, for instance, or how how prisons were constructed and who became the outsider and who had to be controlled, and the order of things and who's so he kind of looked at paintings like Velázquez's Las Maninas to see where is that perspective, like you don't know who's looking at who and who's so when you jumble it up like that, and the only way you can jumble it up is like almost fragmenting it and then like a puzzle putting it together again, and you get insights. It's not like it's going to tell you the whole story or that, but I also don't like to be polemical or too ideological, so that it becomes a material process as well of like literally cutting and pasting and so collage has played a role, even though some of it has been done digitally. So I don't know how much more to talk about. I did make a film about a watchman, and maybe I can show you an excerpt. Again, it's called One Way. So this was another thing that, when you sort of leap into this century, so that, one was this old house, very much one floor, made of a more natural material, sand and lime, in the cantonment with wooden windows. And then you leap 100 years later into our concrete, much like this, our concrete towers. And then what are the spaces that people are sort of existing within? And I found in a friend's apartment that this Nepali watchman, he was living in the electric room of the basement with his entire family. And he had aspirations. He lived in the smallest of spaces. He was servicing those above, but he could never leave the apartment for long because he had to be at the gate. And so then the basement became something fascinating to me, because in a way that became like a proscenium. It became like a theatre, where people came and went, people who lived in the apartment came and went, your vendors came and went, but he was pretty much on the threshold, you know, looking in, looking out, you know, maybe going up to the terrace, looking out, but kind of going out for quick trips and coming back. But if you put a camera in the basement, in a way life could be seen to be like coming in and out, much like a theatre, you know, from the wings. You know. So I sort of interviewed him, of course. You know, the film is also about the Nepali predicament. They also fall. I mean, yeah, the other aspect is, of course, those who live in the interstices of our society, like those who are not kind of, you know, established in terms of, okay, I know who I am. An Anglo-Indian who's actually been living for 3 generations in South India and Bangalore from the early 19th century, but yet sort of, you know, only speaks English, only, you know, lives in this almost this anglicized world, but he's never been out, but still. And then a Nepali who walked across, took him 7 days to walk across to the border, but can really go home, married a local, can imagine the mountains, but he hasn't seen them for years, for like some 25 years or something. He hadn't been back. And so, you know, these are people who often, and fall between the cracks. We don't think of, we tend to, you know, just think of the dominant kind of identities, and there are people who live between that. So I think my work was also looking at that. So this was a series of photographs that, so there's a different watchman. In fact, I was going to make the film about him, and I gave him a little camera with 35mm film, and he was going to go back at Diwali to his village, and I said, photograph, you know, your journey, because I think now it's better connected, but otherwise they would take a train, then they take a bus across the border, then they take another bus, then they walk, and, you know, so it's like a good 1 week before they get to their village. So I said, photograph. Anyway, he didn't come back for 8 months, but when he came back, he actually got me 8 reels of, and he was actually quite conscientious about photographing. So because he was away for 8 months, it was like over 3 seasons or 2 seasons at least, and the weddings and the festivals, and there's the walking as they walk up. I mean, I was quite impressed with him actually. And he's taking the view, and then the family events and the women and dressing up and all kinds of things. So I got a whole, I mean, sometimes he would forget to wind the reels, so he would be photographing one over the other. So I used that as well, because in one of them you see. So that was one thing. Then above, you see, I sort of walked around Kokta, photographing all the sentry posts, all the watchman guard, where the guards sit. And within that, depending on like who the guard, where the guard's coming from, and then there's the daytime and the nighttime guard and all of that, they would leave traces of their identities. Either, you know, so sometimes you have a Christ and a Ganesha and a, you know, a Devi and everything, all the different gods are represented there. And then there are different tiffin carriers or their things that they brought, just so that they can make home. And again, you know, they're sitting, it's within, you know, how big those areas are. So then I looked inside and outside. So one, of course, is the architecture of the actual building, and then within is how the humanness of people marking their space, however small and however difficult. Yeah, so I think, you know, more recently I've been painting, and I think those of you who saw my exhibition, it's, you know, it's much more about nature, and yet I'm kind of interested in how landscape has transformed. And so by collecting this material from the past, obsolete things, by default you start seeing a chronology of change. So it's not all just about an impressionist view of the landscape, though I have been drawing and doing painting as well, but it is also connected to some of these artifacts that I collect. And so there is that sort of dissonance between what one sees as being pristine, but actually it has been intervened with and sometimes violently transformed, like in a collection of photographs called the Bangalore Hunt, where the British would hunt the small animals of this area. And of course we know that there are now no animals left in this area. But that was, a part of leisure activity.
Thank you. It's been a while. Any questions? I have a question. I mean, you haven't talked about your aspect as an educator. This is.
Yeah. But I thought it was an artist talk.
It is. No, the question is basically if one aspect of your work is you find something and then that leads you to another work and that leads you to another work. Yeah. And
I'll be very honest with you, because when I went to art school, and I went to a very conventional art school in Baroda, where we had sculpture, painting, graphic design. Have any of you been to such a, have you studied art or that? Yeah. So, I always had a struggle with what to paint, like either you're encouraged to be a little bit imitative, like you have people who you have to look up to within the department, or you're encouraged to look into history and find in those days they used to say fathers, I mean, you really came upon the word mothers of, art history, but it was like you had to, attach yourself to, an abstraction, in which case you found, so that was pretty much how, we were taught. Of course, we were encouraged to draw from life and go out into the city and travel. And I think, in a way, my work still contains that. It's narrative in that sense. It's about people. It's about, events. It's taken from things that have existed. There's a realism to it. But I always found it difficult, like just, and it used to oppress me actually, just being in front of a white canvas and trying to figure out how to, bring in elements of life into it, and you have to balance everything. You've got to, okay, are you going to do it like Picasso did, or Matisse, or are you going to look at Ram Kumar, or are you going to look at, your Ghulam Sheikh, or your own contemporaries. So I think I just found, and I was always a bit literary. I liked reading and writing, and I was never just happy doing that, like being alone in a cubicle with my blank canvas or piece of paper. So it was a sort of attempt to try to kind of find, that enchantment also. Like, what is it that really excites you? Like, going and talking to somebody, or having him open up a box of photographs, or, discovering something, outside of yourself, that, and yet, I started off, it was very much about myself, the photographs and my grandmother's, but it sort of also had that social component to it, which was also fascinating. I was reading a lot of things about, it was, like I said, there was deconstruction, but also decolonization, and about colonial sort of, how we've been shaped very much by, the histories of colonialism. So there are lots of, Edward Said and Foucault, and now I read much less, but at that point these were all ideas, and one is influenced by that, and yet you have to find your own. I mean, that's the important thing as a student, is take your time, but you have to find your own. It's a passion. It's connected to your DNA. It's connected to who you are, who you've been, and what you want to become. But you have to find your own. You have to map your own path, right? Because we're very prone to also being imitators, and we want to also do well and be liked and all of that. So we can also just find our forefathers or our ancestors in things that we're doing. But it's important to kind of keep coming back and checking on what is it that really excites me, what is it that, and then even if it's something quite disparate or something, it's like, yeah, you love this music or something, but then there are ways in which you can connect it,
Also, it's interesting that, now that we've seen your presentation, that the work is also about landscapes. There are a lot of changing landscapes. Even the work from Cool or the city, right?
And now, of course, it's much more, it's telescoping into the actual landscape and the specifics of a landscape. I've been drawing fungus and drawing, and some of it is quite pretty, but
was there any influence or impact during, I'm very fascinated by the whole journey that you've been on. During the emergency, during Indira Gandhi's, you were saying how there are multiple layers that are at play.
Of course, I was very young, but actually my father was a cartoonist, a political cartoonist. And he became known in Delhi those years when he was drawing for the papers, because also some of his cartoons were censored. So it was very much in my subconscious because I have a memory, but I was 12. So but I think politically, definitely that kind of connection to the topical, or that connection to a sort of some social or political, that. And it was a very, very lively time, right? Because there was a lot of debate, a lot of argument, a lot of good things came out of the bad things, a lot of bad things happened, oppressive things, but a lot of, I think our entire NGO culture and feminist movement, so many things kind of emerged out of that experience of people having to go underground and talk and, resist, the state, and that understanding of the state also became much clearer. So it influenced me, but only peripherally because I was too young, But it was definitely, that was the India I knew,
How much of an influence was Abu in your kind of practice as an artist or as a person?
I think everything, I think all my education came from him, and when I was growing up, I hated school, and I hated doing exams and studying from those CBSE textbooks, and, but I got a lot of exposure through them. And so it was everything, and yet it took me much longer than maybe a lot of people to find my own space. That's why, in a way, I value that, because, sometimes, you're either influenced by the institution or by a mentor or by a parent or something, and these can be very strong influences. And
I have a question. Had you been working with new media before 95? before your first show? I mean,
I think I got exposed when I lived in New York.
Right.
That, because there was a lot of questioning, especially this painting, and then I realized how actually oppressive it was for me, because there was this whole thing on the death of painting, because it was connected to the death of the author, which was also coming from, is it coming from Foucault or Derrida, or yeah, it was coming that
author Dante.
huh?
Author Dante.
Yeah, Arthur Dante, yeah. So that, it's the author is not because, you are, but that in a way your work is kind of, I think it's just because there was myths around artists, right? So once you had kind of killed off the author in a way, then it was an open field for discovery.
Yeah, the reason also why I asked
And then
this-
it broke down the walls of painting, sculpture, so that sound could be. And I had professors who would say, thought is a medium also. Like thinking is a medium. So honing your thinking is also a practice. And you do that through multiple ways, by meeting people, by traveling, by reading, by seeing things, but it's continuously kind of working on the quality of your thinking. And that's almost as important as churning, or if not more, churning out a lot of artifact.
Yeah, the reason why I asked you this question was also because at the time, I think around 2000s, there were a lot of artists in India who were already trying or engaging in alternative or new media practices. So do you realize that you come from a place of privilege because you were able to have exposure or resources to work with these new mediums? Because not everyone, like you said, not everyone had a habit of carrying a camera or recording or taping, but you had access to those people who did, which in a way...
I mean, by the time I was looking for people who had, and that was the misnomer, that was everyone thought that it was only the privilege, and it's true that there were some Maharajas or whatever who had cameras. But so did middle class people, because I interviewed this headmaster of a school, a Muslim school in Shivajinagar. And he lived in a small, he brought up his children, his family, he's very middle class. But he got obsessed, and that's the era where a lot of people wanted to go to Bollywood. They wanted to go to Bombay, and they wanted to either direct films or be, And he then married and he couldn't do that. But then he would save up whatever and there were these second-hand cameras that, you see, by the time the British were leaving and these cameras had circulated, they were also going into the camera shops. So you could buy new cameras, but you could also go into these shops and buy old cameras. So people would sell them off or drop them off there. If you have a passion, you can spend a lot of money on your daughter's wedding, or you can buy a fridge, an expensive fridge, but you can buy a camera too. And that creativity is coming from, that was what interested me about amateur film and photography, is that creativity is coming across different areas, and it's not just those going to art school. And yet art school is also quite you have people, especially because our education was relatively free till recently. So you had people coming from all backgrounds into FTI, into Baroda, into JJ School of Art. It's not like just, you had your Maharani, the princesses and all that as well.
But I think in fact now it's inverted. Only the privileged can go to an art school.
No, but then there are so many art schools. There's so many art schools, but the privileged won't go to some of these art schools. There are art schools, like Karnataka is the largest number of art schools in all kinds of fossil towns. But and sometimes they're tribal children or whatever, and it's like nominal, but they aren't necessarily well taught, and yet you can never tell when an individual actually has the resources to teach themselves.
Like you said, thinking is a part of practice, no? So kind of talking to as many people as possible.
Yeah, you won't feel it now, but then you'll find like in a few years from now that it's, filtered in.
Cool. Any thoughts?
I actually have a question. We're talking earlier about like imitation and influence, right? So where's that line between imitation and influence?
Sometimes it's important to imitate, like you go through. It's a passage. Like, definitely I think my work also has, So it's a passage, but so long as you see it as a passage, you will, because it is a journey or it is a way in which you discover, what it is you like and you don't like, and sometimes discovering what you don't like is important. So it's important to attach yourself, like it's important not to be closed to influence, because the other end of the spectrum is that you just think everything I do is me and this is what I want to do and I'm just going to do this and I don't care about what anybody else is doing and blah blah. And then that makes you just like you won't even know that you're just limited and you're repeating yourself and so part of growing and and the reason why you get an education is that and yet when you after you've done your exams and everything, you find that a lot of what you've learned is irrelevant, right? And then you just kind of have to keep looking and finding it. So it's lifelong. So I would say it's important to be influenced, like like you get into what Yashas is doing and what is his process and how creates and brings in different things and then you would start seeing that okay, this really excites me and that I'd like to bring this into it as well, and so it's a passage. Yeah, and I think imitation is like when you start looking like somebody else, like you just.
But then there's this also, like in art, there's this idea of appropriation, which is there, and I think that's very relevant to her work as well.
Yeah, which is appropriating other things.
Other things, which is not exactly copying, but then growing upon it or like adding, a new sense of direction perspective to it. So that would be like the growth line.
Appropriation also, like that of the author, became also a trope. Again, it's a fine line because you have to be careful what you appropriate. Like it was easy for me to appropriate sort of material that was shot in the 19th century, in the turn of the century, and I can't just appropriate Yashas's work and then add my two-bit on it and then call it my own, because there is, besides copyright rules and laws, there is respect. You also cannot just steal somebody else's work and ideas. So that's a kind of given, or it's not defined, but etiquette.
Also, so sorry, I just had this question. When you source these different types of digital files, be it audio or visual, do you take permission permission from, obviously you take permission from the creator, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Or
especially...
their families or...
Yeah, yeah. And I show it to them, and I was always, like for instance, in my early films, they were more biographical films because these are people who have made things but have never actually shown it and never been acknowledged for it. So they are actually more than happy to share and to be, you know, and Tom was always writing to his son saying, oh, somebody's making a film on me, you know, and it was hardly a film, it was art. But, so they, you know, and then with some others I'm like more tentative, I don't know whether it's stepping into territory that could cause an issue. But as I sort of collected more and more, I became a little more cavalier about it. Like I wanted to experiment. I didn't want to just make straight biographical films. I wanted it to be, you know, the way I wanted it to be, you know. So you get, and then, you know, I visit the people and I would show it to them and I would give them a copy. Then, like one film he was a Punjabi who moved from Lahore during partition to Delhi, and he had a camera. He'd lost his first camera and got another. And I showed him the film, but I didn't use any of the interviews. So, you know, one way to do it is like I did all these interviews, so I give the family a copy of the interviews. Then I digitize their work, which have been lying in schools for years. So I digitize the work so it's more accessible for the family. And then, you know, when my work showed in Paris at this museum, the Pompidou, then his daughter and granddaughter went from London to see it and things, you know, and so yeah, you kind of keep in touch with them, and you know, so there are different ways in which you sort of, but I mean, like I said, the beauty of it is also the connection and the relationship, you know, that access. Not that they become close friends, but you know, it's a world that opens up to you. Just like documentary film.
Want a snack?